sort of a spiritual missionary, these people are hurting us, let's go get them. We went to a sort of quantitative, volume-based, oh my goodness, the tidal wave, and it's just starting. I'm going to actually start this panel with Gary, because like me, Gary is at the place where he actually has wisdom, not just smarts. That means we're both old. And when I first talked to Gary about patents, he said, let me tell you about when this first happened, right? Because if you read the Constitution about what's patentable, it doesn't say anything about software. And when I was growing up, software was copyrightable. That was the way we protected software. And because copyright is the way you protect expression, and software is an expression, right? It's ones and zeros, it expresses something. But Gary remembers those days and when the switch flipped and suddenly software became patentable and the patent office started getting all these applications. So Gary, I'm going to let you sort of tell the story of the days of yore and
Right.
And everybody, when you talk, give sort of the 30-second or the 1-minute background, and we'll sort of go from there. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I was in Spain lecturing a few months ago, and the moderator said, wow, this guy actually saw Jimi Hendrix live. I said, is that it? That's it? That's why I'm qualified. But yeah, back in, I started Computer Law Reporter in 1982, which was the first publication that dealt with computer technology and the law specifically, and it's still going on. And then I worked for the government at the International Trade Commission, and I argued in 1983 that object code embodied in ROM should be copyrightable. And we took that case, and it was one of the first cases to hold that was true, that we could protect software development using copyright law. At the time, we did that because it was so uncertain that patents would cover that technology, and we were afraid of creating this tsunami of vague patents on just about everything you can particularly put into a claim. So we worked with really trade secret and copyright for a while. And then the doors kind of blew open on a few Supreme Court cases and changing attitude at the patent office. And we began to see the examiners actually allowing patents going through that were software driven. We used to do a trick with, back in the late 70s, early 80s, we'd claim everything in analog language and drop in a little phrase that said, oh, you can do this digitally too if you really want to. And we'd sail that by the examiner that way. But anyway, that all fell apart, and the patent office decided they were going to start issuing these patents and examining them. And I think you had a really good signpost speaker early on who told you that these patents are being issued. I have a Lotus one in my briefcase in case anybody wants to see what it looks like. And they're extremely vague. The language is something that sounds, comes out of like something surreal, like a Jean Cocteau movie. When you read these claims, you try to figure out what they really mean. And part of the problem is because these claims are so vague, litigating them, getting them out of the system is very, very expensive and very difficult. So going back, we've kind of followed this trajectory from copyright and trade secret into patents, and we've kind of opened up this Pandora's box.
So Julie's a lawyer and works for EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm sure everybody in San Francisco in the software community knows EFF, and we're thrilled to have EFF and we're thrilled to have you here. It's supposed to be a deal, right? You get a patent and you get a government monopoly, right? This is a big deal, right? Can you imagine if somebody came and said, you have a monopoly for 20 years to just run with this and make all the money you want and nobody can compete with you, in exchange for which you're supposed to tell us what you've invented. A, there has to actually be an invention, and B, you're supposed to disclose it. So what's the problem?
I think, John, first of all, thanks for having us. This is great. And I'm super excited to see all of you here and talking about these issues. It's really important. It's not just important for app developers. It's frankly important for all kinds of people who are working in the technology industry right now. So this is great. And I think you hit on something really important, which is this notice function of patents, this idea that the patent is supposed to put the world on notice of what it covers, has fallen apart with regard to software. And that creates a couple distinct problems. So one of those problems is that you're supposed to be able to read patents, you're supposed to be able to find them first, read them, understand them, and then be able to understand the risk associated with doing what you're doing. So does that, does that make sense? But now, you can't do any of those things, right? they're really difficult to search. And in fact, the Patent Office's search functionality is so crappy that people use Google's, which is better. And even then, it's hard to, and not Google's credit, they've done a great job with their patent search, but it's really hard to find what's out there. And for a whole host of reasons, and I'll talk a little bit about some of them, but it's really in the weeds, software patents are notoriously broad and vague, which is what Gary just said, what we've heard today. In some areas, in some other technological areas, not software, there's consistent language. Certain words are used the same in every patent so someone can kind of understand them. For whatever reason, that's not happened with software. And this is really troubling because software engineers, for the most part, cannot pick up a patent and understand what it says. So they can't understand what it is they can do and can't do with regard to rights that somebody owns. And that's really a very troubling problem. I'm really quickly going to tell you guys a quick anecdote just to kind of paint a picture of how bad this problem is. I was recently talking to someone who told me that he was reading an opinion from the Federal Circuit, which is the court that hears all these patent cases, and in this case, the Federal Circuit got it right, which it often does not, but in this case, it invalidated a pretty crappy software patent. And this engineer was reading the opinion that the court issued, and he said, the whole time he's reading this, and he's like, God, this sounds really familiar, but this patent is so bad, but why does it sound so familiar? And then he gets to the end, and he's like, oh, I invented that patent. And he had no idea until he got to the end. So that's kind of a serious disconnect. And there's just one more thing I'll say. I don't want to talk too long, but there's really interesting work done about the magnitude of these, the quantity of these patents that are out there. Typical smartphone covered by 250,000 patents. So even if you could understand them, you'd have to do nothing for the next decade but read them all.
So I'm going to jump to our other lawyer on the panel, and then we're going to go to the guys who do real work. But so Chris, I want to go back to the notice function, right? If I'm going to do my Oprah thing now, right? So this is a chair. It has a plastic back with holes in it. I file a patent for a chair with plastic holes in the back, right? I can bring it into the patent office. I can show them what I've invented and how no other chair has ever been invented with plastic holes in the back. And we can take pictures of all sorts of chairs and go to catalogs and things like that. So let's say I had a software to do the pattern of the holes in the chair, right? I mean, this is really creative. This is really brilliant. Why wouldn't I just show them, instead of showing them the chair, why wouldn't I show them the code? Like say, here, this is why this code is different, unique, not obvious, and brilliant. And then it would be obvious to every other coder that that's the code I'm not allowed to copy that code because that code is patented.
But you could, but you're not going to if you're a patent prosecutor yourself, right? I hate to say it, but if a patent prosecutor was doing his job...
A patent prosecutor is like an inventor, right?
The patent prosecutor is the lawyer who is responsible for taking the inventor's invention, translating it to something that can be understood, quote unquote, by the patent office, and that ultimately results in your patent. Patent prosecutors, if they're good, their sole purpose is to get as broad of claim language as you possibly can while still getting your patent allowed, which means you don't want to be limited by anything you put as a preferred embodiment or a preferred description of what your invention actually comprises. So don't do it.
So wait, I want to get this down to really simple words. So if I actually show you what I invented, specifically, that would mean my patent is limited to specifically what I invented. That would be terrible.
Not necessarily. For the purpose of today's discussion, I don't think you want to go down to the route of what you need to show. You simply need to provide enough language so that someone reading your claims, which is the core part of the protectable aspect of the patent, to show that you've enabled it. You've described the method in which it actually works. So, if you've described, you say something's analog, and then you say, well, it's digital. A litigator is going to challenge whether or not the digital aspect of what you've described is actually disclosed in the patent. And if you hadn't, they're going to say that you failed to meet the limitations required under the Patent Act, and therefore your patent isn't valid or enforceable. But the reality is you're going to take that risk. depending on what you're trying to achieve with your patents.
So we have two things here. One is, have you adequately described, right? And it sounds like the description of your patent is this dance, where you try to describe it in as broad a possible term so that your patent is as broad as possible and is really becomes a weapon, right? The examiner's job is to try to, sort of play this game with you. It's almost like rope-a-dope, right? When Muhammad Ali fighting George Foreman, trying to figure out, I'm old too, trying to figure out exactly where to hit because he's not really sure actually what you've invented. The second issue seems to be, how do I know that you've invented anything? You haven't even given me the code. I don't know if you actually have operating code.
Well, the problem is one, as mentioned earlier, a lot of the patent prosecutors mainly don't have the time, and sometimes they don't have the technical know-how. And sometimes
The prosecutors or the examiners?
I'm sorry, the examiners. Possibly a combination of both, right? Your prosecutor may not know what you're telling him because, particularly if it's very novel, if it's so novel that no one's ever seen it, then in reality, this is the first time he's ever described it, right? That is limited circumstances and probably aren't going to be the patents that we're talking about today, but that is the situation. But the examiner has the issue of he can only spend a limited amount of time with the patents, number one. And number two, despite the fact that they try and push the patents into the proper grouping for the proper examiner to review them, that's not always the case.
So it's not as simple as looking at a bridge strut or a new shoe and saying, yo, you've invented something. This is really like total smoke and mirrors and we're giving you a government monopoly.
I mean, I think patent prosecutors at the patent office would disagree with that assessment, but in reality, there's only, it's like with anything that the people in the audience are doing. You only have so much time to handle a particular task. Are you going to make sure that 100% of it is perfect, or are you going to do 95% to make sure that you don't piss off your users, right? Patent examiners are taking that same approach.
So Damien, do you have any patents?
We do.
How many?
We just got, right before this thing, we just got issued another patent with 22 claims in the location geo field. But, more important to me is that I could sit on a soapbox and tell everybody here. By the way, I founded a company called Banjo. It's a location-based platform here in the Valley. I can sit on my soapbox and we can talk about patent trolls, and if we get into that conversation, I'm happy to engage on what a realistic way of cutting them off at the knees might look like. But, our government has had an opportunity. Congress had an opportunity to change the laws here recently. They didn't. Supreme Court had an opportunity. They didn't. And so as an entrepreneur, and as other entrepreneurs, I look out there in the audience there, we just get shit done. That's what we do as entrepreneurs, right? And so the reality is this is the landscape that we have to play with. And so we file patents to protect us, especially from the bigger companies, right? And that's why we file patents. And I hear a lot of my friends are also either in startups or maybe even above the startup, and I ask them why they haven't filed patents, and well, it's the cost or it's the time. And even now there's a lot of you talked about this, looking at patents and would the engineers even understand what they're looking at. It's not even that. Engineers now are discouraged to look at patents because if they discover the patent and they ignore it, then they're responsible for triple damages if that becomes found out. And so many of the companies that I talk to, they encourage their engineers, don't even bother looking at it, just write the patent and we'll put it through the office, and if it gets approved, it does, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. For us, maybe for many of you, I'm not sure they covered this earlier, but there's a way for you to get your patent through much sooner. It costs a couple extra $1,000. But the reality of it is you'll know in a very short time frame whether or not it's going to get approved or not. And that's what Banjo does. I figure if we're going to spend the amount of money to have a prosecutor file a patent on our behalf, and we've spent the time writing the patent up internally and understanding what we're doing with it, we might as well spend the extra money to find out whether or not this thing should get done. And it's been very successful for us. So I always hear the argument that the process is, there's a 5-year backlog in patents. Well, there is, or there might be as much as a 5-year backlog, but you can actually get around that today, and that's been successful for us. So,
Do you want to tell us how you got around that?
We just paid the extra money, and it was just the reality was you pay, I think it's $2,000 or $2,500. Is that about right?
Yeah, I'm actually a patent litigator, not a prosecutor, so I don't know what the specific terms are, but yeah, there's a fast track for getting patents through the patent system, and there's actually the new legislation, despite the fact that it didn't accomplish everything, there's a way to sort of go after business method patents as well. So that's the one legislation. Yeah.
So
Just
Damien,
certain business methods, only these like random financial ones. Can I ask you a quick question, Damien? Sorry, John.
That's all right.
Taking over. Do you feel like when you have to spend that time and that energy and those resources getting patents, that that's something that's core to your business, or is that something that you feel like is kind of a drag on your business?